Now we will move to the third part of this lesson, which is about the sign presented and sign interpreted broadcasting differences. In this section, we will talk about the different language skills for media sign language interpreters, some of which we have already discussed in the previous section. We will also talk about the translating and interpreting process for broadcasting, and we will also introduce deaf interpreters. Sign-presented programs using a deaf native signer have been described to be the most effective way to include sign language on screen. Normally, sign language used by deaf native signers provide a better linguistic input. For example, deaf people tend to be more expressive and can adapt to register more naturally, for example. But also, they can provide a better cultural input. So, for example, information organization in a spoken language and in a sign language can be different in order, for example, or in quality. However, sign language presented programs are not the only way to include sign language on screen. And normally what we find is sign-interpreted TV programs, which are designed for the hearing or a wider audience. So in the literature, it has been described that sometimes sign-interpreted TV programs are difficult to comprehend, difficult to understand, so that this lack of comprehension has been ascribed to different facts. One of those is the lack of technical quality, like, for example, the size of the interpreter, as we mentioned, or maybe the speed. Also, sometimes this lack of comprehension has been ascribed to the deaf user characteristics, maybe because of the divided attention. They have to attend to the interpreter and to the visual media alternatively, so that some information is missed. Or also because the lack of education or the low education of the deaf person, the signing skills the deaf signer might have, which might not be like a native signer. And also, this lack of comprehension has sometimes been ascribed to the interpreter's characteristics. For example, poor interpreting skills, poor signing skills, or the lack of preparation time. So, for non-live broadcasting, the preferred type of service would be a sign language translation rather than a sign language interpretation. And in a sign language translation, several stages in the translating process could be planned, and also different agents like deaf users, sign language linguists, or sign language interpreters could be involved in the different translation processes to grant the maximum quality of the service. So ideally, the best practice would include mixed teams with deaf and hearing individuals, which would be bilinguals in both the spoken language and the sign language that are involved in the interpreting or translation process. So, for example, the deaf, when we need to translate from a text to sign language, a hearing individual would do a first translation into sign language, and the deaf signer would resign and fine-tune the sign language text. And in the opposite direction, when the translation or interpreting would be from a signed text to a written text or a spoken text, first the deaf user could translate into the written form, and then the hearing individual fine-tune the text or rehearse the spoken text. But sometimes for live programs, sign language translation is not possible, and sign language interpretation it's the only access, the only possible access for broadcasting sign language. When this is the case, two different kinds of interpreters could be used. One would be hearing interpreters and the other deaf interpreters. So each of these professional profiles have advantages and disadvantages. For example, hearing interpreters can interpret directly from spoken language into sign language, and they can be auditorily cued. But sometimes they lack this native or natural or expressive sign language. Whereas deaf interpreters cannot be auditorily cued, can only be visually cued, for example, through printed text or glosses, which is using written text to represent the structure of the sign language, or shadowing a hearing interpreter. Of course, if no visual cues are available, the text should be memorized. If you want to know more about deaf interpreters and their professional profile, you can access the WASLI website again, or the Deaf Interpreter Institute in the United States, so that you can see the specific competencies that these kind of sign language interpreters have and what kind of services they can develop in a high standard quality. So now it's the time for question number 5. Sign interpreted programs on TV should include A, mixed teams with both hearing and deaf interpreters, B, deaf interpreters only because hearing interpreters do not grant accessibility, C, hearing interpreters only because deaf interpreters cannot hear the auditory cues. And the right answer is A. Sign interpreted programs on TV should ideally include a mixed team with both hearing and deaf interpreters that could fine-tune the final interpreted text.